Tales of Onoris, written by Lucius Kane. Available on Royal Road, link in the description.
1611, Darley Era. The rain showered the land relentlessly. Dark clouds blot out the sun, veiling the land in darkness, the only light coming from the lightning that brightened the sky, bringing ear-splitting thunder that shook the castle of the Rheatonseys violently. At the castle gates, cavalrymen awaited their lord, 𝐓𝐚𝐥𝐬, under the banner of his house. A black flag with red outlines and the image of a wyvern mooring. It fluttered under the intense wind. In the castle, 𝐓𝐴𝐥𝐬 Rheatonsey, the new lord, sat in his chambers awaiting news of his wife, and the child that would be born to him, along with his mother and other family members. He was a young man with blue eyes, black hair, and a sharp jawline. 𝐓𝐴𝐥𝐬 was worried, but for reasons other than the birth of his child. 𝐓𝐴𝐥𝐬's wife, Cynthia, was welcomed only by a few family members. She was put under suspicion due to ties with her family, the 𝐏𝐫𝐾𝐬, who allied themselves with a witch coven to the east of the land of Satano, a region in the Principality of 𝐧𝐨𝐈𝐤, which broke away from our kingdom in a bloody rebellion dubbed the Traitor War. With accusations of using magic forbidden for a century, Cynthia was continuously persecuted and was not considered a candidate for marriage. Even though all this occurred, 𝐓𝐴𝐥𝐬 still fell in love with her and made it his priority to be her husband. On that night, their suspicions were made true. As Cynthia made her final push screaming at the top of her lungs, the baby finally emerged from her womb. The midwives' eyes widened, some covering their mouths to stifle screams of fear. Laying between her legs, a baby boy flayed around, and not a single tear or wail came from the boy, but this wasn't unusual. The boy's eyes were red, a deep scarlet red resembling the color of a rose, or blood. The head midwife ordered one of her subordinates to call upon 𝐓𝐴𝐥𝐬. Without hesitation, she ran towards the door. She ran towards 𝐓𝐴𝐥𝐬's chambers where everyone nervously awaited the news. She opened the door wildly, and with frightened eyes, to tell 𝐓𝐴𝐥𝐬 the news of his newly born child. She gasped for breath as she tried to intelligibly deliver the news. "What is it? What's wrong?" 𝐓𝐴𝐥𝐬 asked nervously. "The baby is in good health, my lord," she said as her voice wobbled in her throat. "But..." 𝐓𝐴𝐥𝐬 raised his hand. "Say no more, thank you." 𝐓𝐴𝐥𝐬 had a worried look on his face. His heart raced wildly. His mother and other family members looked at each other with surprise before it turned to disgust. His mother, 𝐼vanna Rheatonsey, strutted up to him with her chin held high in disgust, contorting her face to emphasize how disgusted she was. "𝐓𝐴𝐥𝐬, didn't we warn you of this? You shouldn't have married that witch. That whore. Mother." "Watch your tongue," 𝐓𝐴𝐥𝐬 snapped. "That is my wife you speak of." 𝐓𝐴𝐥𝐬 held his face as he tried to think of what he should do next. He calmed himself before speaking once more. "I will return to speak with you all soon, wait here." 𝐓𝐴𝐥𝐬 stormed out of the room, angry at his mother's words. While he hurriedly walked down the corridor to Cynthia's chambers, his heart raced and his hands shook as he contemplated what his wife had borne to him. He contemplated how this would affect the land he inherited. He reached Cynthia's chambers. He opened the door, heart racing wildly, expecting to see a monster in his wife's arms. 𝐓𝐴𝐥𝐬 dropped to his knees, letting out a sigh of relief. His wife looked beautiful. Her hair was put into a bun and cuffed with a golden flower clip. His son looked like any normal baby, but the only obstacle halting him from screaming in joy was the eyes of the baby boy. 𝐓𝐴𝐥𝐬 approached Cynthia's bed with happiness being held back. Cynthia's smile quickly turned into sadness as 𝐓𝐴𝐥𝐬 sat by her bedside quietly. With a sigh, he spoke. "Cynthia, my love, what happened to my son?" he asked, sadness wobbling in the back of his throat. Cynthia put her hands on 𝐓𝐴𝐥𝐬's face, tears welling in her eyes before streaming down her face. "My love, I am exhausted, so please, I beg of you to have patience." 𝐓𝐴𝐥𝐬 held his wife's hand and gave it a reassuring squeeze. "Okay then, my love, I look forward to our conversation." 𝐓𝐚𝐥𝐸 placed his hand on his tiny son's face and kissed his head. "He's beautiful," 𝐓𝐴𝐥𝐸 said, tears running down his face. "Before you leave, 𝐓𝐴𝐥𝐸, we must give him a name," Cynthia said to her husband. He stared at his son for a while before giving his answer. "Zarek, his name shall be Zarek, the name my father once carried with pride." 𝐓𝐴𝐥𝐸 arose and placed a kiss on his wife's head before leaving. 𝐓𝐴𝐥𝐸 exited the room and swiftly returned to his chambers. He flung open the doors, startling his family members. A fat and short man stood up from his seat. "So, what of the child?" 𝐓𝐴𝐥𝐸's cousin inquired. 𝐓𝐴𝐥𝐸 didn't respond but looked at all of them with furrowed brows. "A male child has been born to me. He has flaws, but he is still my son. If any of you disapprove, raise your hand so I may see." None of his family members raised their hands, except his mother. 𝐓𝐴𝐥𝐸 tightened the muscles in his jaw as he looked at his mother with a scowl that came from the depths of hell. "And why do you disapprove of his birth, mother?" Her hands trembled as she lowered them, and her voice trembled as she tried to get out her words. "As your mother, and as the former lady of this house, I have the right to give my opinion." 𝐓𝐴𝐥𝐸 cut her off. "Answer me, mother." 𝐓𝐴𝐥𝐸 snapped. "Why do you disapprove? Why should I renounce the claim to my son?" She raised her head, trying to stop the tears from flowing. "Because he and that which will be your downfall," she said. "Her family murdered your father. What do you think she will do to you?" Before 𝐓𝐴𝐸 could respond, a low whelp stopped him from uttering another word. 𝐓𝐴𝐸 raised a finger before sighing. "You will accept my son, or you will renounce your title as a former lady of this house. Now, where is Fabian?" A tear ran down his mother's face, but 𝐓𝐴𝐸 stood firm at the choice he made. His mother knelt and picked up young Fabian before handing him to his father. 𝐓𝐴𝐸 held the young boy in his arms tight and whispered, "What are you doing here, You were supposed to be asleep. Anyway, I must go, son. Guard the house for me," he said, trying to cheer up Fabian. He placed a kiss on Fabian's head before leaving. Oblivious to the storm that approached, the soldiers in their silver armor struck the ground once with their feet before giving a salute. "My lord!" the two men shouted. They turned smoothly on their feet before walking through the bailey towards the gate, followed by 𝐴𝐥𝐸. Waiting at the portcullis was a young man, with a cleanly shaven face, black and messy hair, and blue eyes. "Glad you had the patience to wait for me, Zorian," 𝐴𝐥𝐸 said to him with a smile. Zorian chuckled. "Well, don't expect it to be a regular occurrence. Anyway, I see you are in good spirits, so that means that the child is in good health?" 𝐴𝐥𝐸 rests his arm on the hilt of his sword. "Yes, he is. A beautiful baby boy was delivered." Zorian took a messenger scroll with the seal of the king, a four-pointed star with a hole in the middle. "May the gods give him a long and happy life, but we have other matters. Here, a message from the king." Zorian held a torch over the letter scroll. 𝐴𝐥𝐸's eyes darted from word to word. "What does it say?" Zorian asked curiously. 𝐴𝐥𝐸 rolled the letter neatly, a sense of urgency on his face. "We need to return. The king is mobilizing for a counterattack." 𝐴𝐥𝐸 and Zorian exited the gatehouse, and outside were 50 men all on horseback awaiting their lord. 𝐴𝐥𝐸 and Zorian mounted their horses before heading off along the path. It was a long journey. A week to be exact before they arrived at camp. Tents stretched as far as the eye could see. Some wore the banners of other noble houses, and the most notable ones being the banners of the Bronzemans and Trownings. The Bronzemans had a red and white banner with a bronze hand with an eye in the palm and crown feathers at the bottom. The other banner was the Trownings. It had a golden feather at the bottom with two other feathers sprouting from the sides. The flag was brown and with a golden outline. They were the richest and most influential houses that brought more men than the other noble houses combined. 𝐴𝐥𝐸 and his men made their way into the king's camp. The biggest tent out of all of them was the king's, and it was red with golden outlines. 𝐴𝐴𝐿 and Zorian headed straight into the tent without resistance from the guards that stood outside. Inside the tent, and standing around a table were the nobles of 𝐓𝐶𝐨𝐷𝐤, and at the end of the table was King Alfonso Seyfedien, a tall man with black hair and strong facial features. Even though King Seyfedien was a sight to behold, all eyes turned to 𝐴𝐴𝐿. 𝐴𝐴𝐿 and Zorian quickly bowed. "Your Royal Highness. I sincerely apologize for my late arrival. I hope you may find it in your heart to forgive us," 𝐴𝐴𝐿 said. For a good second, everyone just stared at 𝐴𝐴𝐿, and then at the king before the silence was broken with boisterous laughter, with the king's laugh drowning out everyone else's. "Enough with the formalities, 𝐴𝐴𝐿. Seyfedien assured with a rough voice, "If you had taken a break for 100 years, I still wouldn't be mad at you." 𝐴𝐴𝐿 rose with a grin painted across his face, followed by Zorian. They found a spot on the table where they awaited the king's orders. It was cold, but the fire in the metal hearth kept the room relatively warm. Seyfedien set his jaw and rested his hands on the table, his facial expression turning serious. A feeling of anxiety spread throughout the room. Finally, Seyfedien spoke. "For years, the citizens of 𝐓𝐶𝐨𝐷𝐤 have been plagued with anxiety and fear. 300 years ago, our ancestors won the Battle of 𝐓𝐴𝐿, and 100 years later we survived the 𝐧𝐶𝐈𝐿 cataclysm, which still left millions of monsters roaming this continent. Now, we are dealing with a treat less bad than what our ancestors endured, and we will overcome it with strength and tenacity the likes they had never seen before." The nobles, including 𝐴𝐴𝐿, nodded and responded, "Aye." King Seyfedien stepped away from the table and stood at ease. "Enough rambling from me. Alexander, I invite you to lay down the plan for our attack." Without haste, a man who wore his hair in a ponytail began to move to where the king previously stood. He was covered in black armor with golden edges covered with a silver coat and carried a sword with a golden pommel. He cleared his throat before speaking. "My lords," Alexander said while drawing a long and thin metal rod from his coat. Alexander rests the tip of the rod on the map. "As you can see, we will be outnumbered, but have no fear, my lords. We will still have the upper hand. They will be lightly armored, and our cannons' position on the hill will make light work of their infantry. Our army will be divided into 19 regiments. We shall be stationed at the rear. In front of us will be 5 regiments of swordsmen. In front of the swordsmen, regiments will be 8 spearmen regiments. The last spearman regiment will guard the regiments of archers at the head of the entire army. Our cavalry will guard each flank." A round of applause erupted from the tent, but 𝐴𝐴𝐿 stood indifferent to the boost of morale being thrown around. 𝐴𝐴𝐿 grumbled, "Don't get your hopes up too high, they are ruthless and cunning," 𝐴𝐴𝐿 advised. The applause came to a halt and all eyes were fixated on 𝐴𝐴𝐿. "Don't you have faith?" a noble inquired. 𝐴𝐴𝐿 stood up straight, showing he was not intimidated by the looks he received. "Forgive me, my lords, but faith isn't going to save me from a firebolt. I have faith in skills and tactics because that is what wins battles. This might look good on parchment, but let's see how you all do when the fighting starts." He received some scowls, but that is all they could do, scowl. "I hear you, 𝐴𝐴𝐿. But we are at a loss for time. We need to strike fast and hard. Anyhow, get your men ready, we start tomorrow," Seyfedien commanded. The nobles began to leave, including 𝐴𝐴𝐿 and Zorian. The once relatively silent tent began to bustle with the chatter of the aristocrats. "Zorian, are you ready?" 𝐴𝐴𝐿 asked, concerned. Zorian raised an eyebrow. "What makes you think I'm not?" "Well, you're young, probably the youngest commander in the history of 𝐓𝐶𝐨𝐷𝐤. 𝐴𝐴𝐿 affirmed. "Don't you worry about me, old man, I'll be totally fine." Fire burst from the hearth, stopping 𝐴𝐴𝐿 and Zorian in their tracks. The other nobles whipped their heads around, startled. The king reeled backward, his hands blocking his face from the intense heat. Even through all this chaos, something seemed peculiar to 𝐓𝐿. The fire didn't rise or fall back into the hearth. It stood frozen in one place but still crackled and waved. It slowly began to form an emotionless face as if the fire wore a mask.
A female voice suddenly emerged from the face formed by the fire. It sounded as if multiple people spoke at once, and her voice reverberated through the tent. "You will fall," she said, followed by a chuckle. "You are alone in this fight. Darkness will consume you, and death will plague your people. The gateway is just the beginning. The Supreme who comes after will command a great and ghastly army. Death comes closer every hour."
They all watched in horror and shock at the sight before them, some even dropped to their knees, eyes widened in fear. Before she could utter another word, Alexander outstretched his right arm, and runes formed on his hand. A gush of cold air filled the room, slowly extinguishing the fire. As a final hurrah, the fire condensed into a small ball before flying to the top with lightning speed. With the force of a cannon, a loud explosion burst a hole into the top of the tent, knocking everyone to the ground. 𝐓𝐿 looked at the gray sky through the hole, his mouth open in shock. After what felt like minutes of staring in disbelief, 𝐓𝐿 finally came back to his senses. "The king! The king!" he shouted in horror. He ran to safety and followed by the other nobles. The king's face was covered in ash, and his body looked lifeless. 𝐓𝐿 put his hands on the king's neck. He was still alive. He stood up, blowing a sigh of relief. "Get him to the healer," 𝐓𝐿 commanded. The soldiers from outside rushed in and grabbed the king. The anger in 𝐓𝐿's body was now searing. He grit his teeth and clenched his fist, blood beginning to stream down his palms. This was an unforgivable act, and may the gods help whoever stood in his way. Several weeks had passed. The king's army marched day and night toward the location the battle will take place. Finally, they arrived. They arrived on an open field where a battalion of men already waited, scouting for the approach of the enemy. The 2 magic cannons were already stationed on the hill, with the gunners in position, already manning them. With the order from our general and a blow from the trumpets, the army marched to their assigned positions. Outside was gray, and not a beam of light emerged from the thick clouds. 𝐓𝐿 sat atop a horse at the back of the king's army, 50,000 men strong, alongside his fellow noblemen. The air was still, and not a single sound was heard besides the scavs circling overhead. Ahead of the army was a tree line, and the sound of men marching was emerging from the forest. They were numerous but lightly armored in black. Man after man emerged from the forest onto the field, with some persons who looked to be commanders heavily armored with skull helms. It was sudden. An ear-splitting shot from the magic cannons started the battle. My heart never raced so hard in my life, and my limbs felt weak from shivering in fear and anxiety. I breathed in and out slowly, allowing my nerves to calm. This was my second battle. With a blow of the trumpets, we moved forward, slowly. With unrelenting fury, the cannons fired on the positions of the enemy. The sound of the artillery hitting their positions sent shivers down my spine. I had a hint of sympathy for them. With dust and dirt flung high into the air, the positions of the enemy were completely concealed. The silence was terrifying, but the sound of our men marching gave me some reassurance. For what felt like an eternity, the other end of the battlefield was silent. With a shout from our newly appointed general, the army halted their march. Continuously, the cannons bombarded the enemy's positions. "They can already be all dead," a nobleman nervously said. I wanted information as well, but I couldn't help but keep looking ahead. "Enough!" our general, the king's brother, commanded. He gave an order for one of the cavalrymen to scout ahead. The cavalryman gave the general a fearful look before carrying out his orders. The silence was broken by the neighs and the footsteps of the horse charging toward the enemy. Into the smoke and fog, the lone cavalryman headed, the sounds of his horse becoming ever so distant. It was a while before we heard the sound of the horse again, and I let out a sigh of relief, thankful that we would have a clear knowledge of our situation. To my horror, the horse emerged without a rider. It disrupted our lines as it ran with eyes widened in fear and a bloody saddle. Our eyes followed the horse as it ran off into the distance. Defensive formations. Our general abruptly shouted. Feet stomped upon the ground and metal clanged as the spearmen lifted their shields and kept their tips pointed toward the enemy. I drew my sword ready to foil any plan made by the enemy. Suddenly, I found it difficult to keep my horse steady, pulling the reins to keep him straight. The nobleman beside me struggled with the same situation. It was soon all the horsemen struggled as well. The neighs of our horses filled the battlefield. I whipped my head towards my front once more as the sound of whistling and crackling began to move closer. My gaze was carried to the sky as 4 hot volleys of fire magic were about to rain down on us. "Incoming!" the general shouted. The sky and the ground were illuminated as the attack came closer. The 1st regiment was hit, followed by 3 more as the fire volley slammed into our positions. A wave of wind hit me, knocking me from my horse and sending the air from my lungs. Never in my life has my heart raced so fast. Screams of men were heard coming toward us and more explosions rained down. Our cannons began to work once more. The witch army was descending upon us. "Group up and prepare to charge," the general commanded. I searched around for my horse, but it was nowhere to be found. Out of the blue Zorian emerged. "My lord." "Your horse?" Zorian asked, concerned. "Don't worry," I assured. Still, he left his horse and joined me. Zorian stood next to me, his sword drawn as well. I looked at him and nodded, he returned the nod as well. With a wave of the general's sword, we charged forward to death or victory. I screamed as I charged forward. Lines of soldiers clashed with uncontrollable fury. Firebolts and other magical elements whistled overhead, men were pulverized and maimed. Men screamed for their mothers, as troop line after troop line moved forward over men dead, or dying. Cavalry crashed into the fray, sending men hundreds of feet into the air. To my horror, I came upon an enemy soldier. The man screamed and charged, but my mind became clear and I became heartless. Runes formed on my hands indicating I was using man. I strengthened my arms and blocked his attack, driving my sword deep into his stomach. Around me, men clashed. Once again another man charged at me. His weapon missed and I slammed my weapon into the man's neck, his blood covering my face. Man after man charged at me, but they all met the fate of the others. My blood quickened with bloodlust as I began to turn mad with rage. The arrow of the enemy struck my shoulder, I felt it enter my skin, but the pain was nowhere to be found. "Just try and kill me," I shouted in rage. He shot at me once more, I swat away his arrow and shoved my weapon deep into his face. For hours we fought and the bodies were beginning to pile. The general ordered the reconfiguration of our formation. What was he doing? The horde of the witch army would pick off the rest of us if we turned our back to regroup. "Group up and hold the line," I shouted, hoping the men would hear my cries. The black horde of the witch army charged toward us, trampling their dead. The magic cannons slammed into the enemy's formation, hurling bodies into the air. The sky was streaked with the smoke of magic going to and fro through the air. The general had kept 1 regiment of swordsmen at his command, but he sent them forth to join the formation he was forming. Men fell one by one as they turned their backs to head for the safety of the formation. This was a slaughter that could have been prevented. I poured magic into my arms and tightened my grip on my weapon. A noble, who was on horseback, moved swiftly, hoping to get to the general's formation. He stopped in front of me and extended his arm, "𝐓𝐚𝐥𝐸." He shouted, "Get on!" I held his hand and jumped on the horse. Swiftly, he made his way to the formation. Before he could stop, I hopped off the horse and ran toward the general. "Your Highness," we must hold this line," I advised. I could tell he was afraid. "Your Highness, I know you are planning to retreat, but you mustn't, we must hold this line." The coward did not even listen to me. He ordered some of his men to go with him and he ran along with the other nobles. Zorian came up behind me with eyes widened in fear and shock at what he had just witnessed. "It is okay, Zorian," I assured. "If we die giving the bastards a fight they would never forget. Now, give me your horse." Zorian obliged and I went toward the soldiers who still fought. "Fall back and hold a defensive line," I commanded. I looked toward the gunners on the hill. I raised my arm and signaled for them to fire at the enemy. The support from the cannons allowed the rest of the men to retreat. We lost a third of our army and the dark horde just kept coming. Heading to the front of the army, I raised my sword high and began to speak, all while the cannons battered the witch army's advance. "Men of the 𝐏𝐸𝐴𝐻, your leaders have abandoned you. They have left you to face the onslaught of a horde that has no morals or values. Traitors that have come to conquer a land that they betrayed." I paused for a moment as the explosions behind me drowned out my voice. "I ask you this day to not for your king, fight for your family's future, fight for yourself. Because at the end of the day, no one can save you but you. Today is as far as they'll go. Summon your courage, summon your strength. Let's give these bastards a trip to their masters from hell." The defensive line erupted in cheers. This was good. If we fail here, our kingdom would be brought to ruination. The gunners stopped firing. I looked to the hill they sat upon, and the gunners waved their arms to signal their ammo had run dry. It mattered not, we held the line and waited for the witch army to reach our line. I dismounted my horse and sent it on its way. I joined the line, taking cover behind one of the shields of the spearmen. The Battle of Lockwood was a Pyrrhic victory. The witch army retreated, but the men of 𝐏𝐸𝐴𝐻 didn't bother to give chase, they were exhausted. This worthless battle didn't change the predicament of the Principality of 𝐏𝐸𝐴𝐻 for the future years to come.
4 years after the Battle of Lockwood, 𝐏𝐤𝐻 and his wife sat in their garden surrounded by their children, the youngest being the newborn, a baby girl named Anya who had the same golden eyes as her mother, was cuddled in 𝐏𝐤𝐻's arms. The first child, Fabian, and Zarek, the scarlet-eyed beauty as his mother would call him, played in the garden. It was getting late and supper was about to be served. "Zarek! Fabian!" Cynthia called. "We are heading inside." Zarek and Fabian ran to their mother, holding her hands tightly and giggling. As 𝐏𝐤𝐻 and Cynthia, accompanied by their children, walked down the hall, a servant ran towards them. "My lord." "My lady," she said, bowing. "My lord, your mother is here to see you." Cynthia and 𝐏𝐤𝐻 gave each other surprised looks. "Tell her I'm on my way," he said with the biggest smile on his face. The servant smiled and bowed before walking away toward Ivana. Quickly after she left, Cynthia turned towards 𝐏𝐤𝐻, nervousness painted on her face. "Take Fabian and Anya with you, I'll stay with Zarek." 𝐏𝐤𝐻 snapped, "No. This is my house. I will not tolerate disrespect towards you or my son." Cynthia still pleaded with 𝐏𝐤𝐻. "Please. My family caused many deaths, your mother would not tolerate my nor Zarek's presence. Please, just let Zarek and I stay." 𝐏𝐤𝐻 sighed, "Of course, your sweet plea for secrecy has touched my heart." He placed a sweet kiss upon Cynthia's lips and took Fabian from her hands. Zarek and Cynthia watched as 𝐏𝐤𝐻 left with Anya and Fabian. "Mommy!" Zarek cried. "I want to go too." Tears began to stream down Cynthia's eyes. "Sorry, my son, but for your safety, you must stay hidden, do you understand?" Zarek shook his head while biting his fingers.
Thank you for listening. Subscribe for Chapter 1, Castle in the Snow.